January 1st, 1946. Just a few weeks after Landry's finally sent home from Europe after 30 combat missions, he goes to Dallas to watch his college, the University of Texas, take on Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. The man quarterbacking the team? Bobby Lane, who would later become the star of the Detroit Lions. Right now, he's achieving fame in his own right with UT, as his reputation for going out and getting intoxicated and yet still delivering on the football field the very next day was already well established. Landry writes that Lane never trained, and he wonders just how good he would have been if he had worked harder. So Landry re-enrolls in UT and finds that the campus has changed dramatically since he left for the war in the middle of his freshman year. You see, President Roosevelt had signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, and student enrollment had exploded across the country. You suddenly had older college players, some in their late 20s, who were competing with students just out of high school. In addition to this, the players coming home from the war brought a seriousness and maturity to them that had not been present before, but there was also an overall sense of purpose and hope. Unfortunately, in the spring of 1946, his first semester back, Landry injured his leg during spring drills and ended up on crutches. Then, in preseason, he gets injured again and sees limited action as a fullback. Now, College Football Reference, which is usually pretty good, has an interesting omission that could lead to some timeline confusion. As of the recording of this video, if you go to see Tom Landry's profile, it only lists 1947 and 1948, where he actually did get some playing time in the fall, albeit limited. In fact, the October 13th, 1946 edition of the Evening Star recounts his team, the Texas Longhorns, beating Oklahoma 20-13, and further down, you'll see Tom Landry had thrown an interception. In College Football Reference's defense, they can't be expected to catch every single minor detail from the thousands and thousands of player profiles that they have to juggle. That's my job.
In episode 2F09, when Ichi plays Scratchy's skeleton like a xylophone, he strikes the same rib twice in succession, yet he produces two clearly different tones.
What the hell are you talking about?
On December 16th, 1946, Landry got drafted by the New York Giants. Steve Owen, the Giants head coach, had come to the Longhorns practice and seen Landry punt and decided to use a 7th round pick on him, even though Landry wouldn't be eligible to play professional football for a few seasons. The concept of playing pro ball wasn't something he thought about much, as it wasn't really covered by the Texas media. Anyway, he would shelve those thoughts for now and focus on the upcoming year. So 1947 comes around, the first year Landry gets significant playing time. Coach DX Bible had just retired, so assistant coach Blair Cherry takes over, and it's here that Cherry takes the offensive switch from a single wing to a T formation. Prior to the start of the 47th season, Cherry took Lane with him to Chicago to observe the Bears' training camp and see how Coach Hallis and quarterback Sid Luckman ran their offense. So the Texas Longhorns adapted the style of play and ran with it. And it was, of course, Landry's job as a backup to Lane to also learn this offense. Starting in 1941, college teams allowed unlimited substitution, and this led from a player being used on both offense and defense to one that would normally only play on one side. Well, Coach Cherry would take Lane out, the other team had the ball, and have Landry as Lane's backup, playing defense. So the Texas Longhorns get off to a great start, defeating Texas Tech 33-0, and Oregon 38-13. However, in the Oregon game, Landry broke his right thumb. So since that's his throwing hand, he's moved from being backup quarterback to fullback. Landry might have had a chance to get back to the quarterback position, but the next game sealed his fate. Against North Carolina, while playing at fullback, Landry aggravated the injury to his thumb even more, and this permanently led to him being unable to get a proper grip on the football well enough to throw. He had some success as a runner, though, as he gained 91 yards and 12 carries with 1 touchdown. Even though UT had 17,000 students in 1947, there were only about 5,000 women attending. So Landry reached out to Gloria Newhouse, the girlfriend of teammate Lou Holder, and asked for help in setting him up on a date. So she approached Alicia Wiggs, suggesting a double date with her, going out with her boyfriend, and Alicia going out with Landry. Alicia didn't like the idea, but Newhouse was persistent, and since she was an older sorority sister, she insisted Alicia go out on a date with Landry as a pledge. In other words, using the power of college politics, She had to do it. So the day after the game against North Carolina, Landry shows up to take her out. So, picture this. You open the door and see a guy with a black eye, a bandaged thumb, and scrapes on his face. That must have been an interesting first impression. He took her out on a picnic at Bull Creek, and he said she evidently took pity on him as they hit it off. So, if you're single and going on a blind date with someone, try the strategy of looking like someone just beat you up. Back to the Longhorns. They continued to be undefeated until they faced SMU. Doak Walker, a former high school teammate of Bobby Lane, was their star player and running back. The game was close, and with a score of 14-13 in favor of SMU, the Longhorns needed just a few more yards to get into field goal range, but Landry was supposed to take a handoff from Lane, but he instead slipped on the wet grass. This caused Lane to abandon the handoff and try to run himself, where he was tackled. That was UT's only loss of the season. Winning the rest out, they faced Alabama in the Sugar Bowl. UT's second-string fullback got the flu, forcing Landry to play the entire game on both offense and defense. The Longhorns won, though, blowing out Alabama 27-7. After the game, though, instead of celebrating with his teammates in the New Orleans French Quarter, Landry felt so tired that he simply went back to his hotel room and fell asleep. Back to Alicia. For dates, they go to one of two movie theaters that gave UT football players free passes. They frequented the El Matador restaurant, which worked out since she loved Mexican food and thought it was great they had that in common, but the real reason was that was the cheapest place, so he was thinking practically. Now, later on in life, the couple would frequent another Mexican restaurant up in Dallas. While he did like Mexican food, it was more of a case of poor college student syndrome. And the summer of '48, just before his senior year, Landry got a job in Kerrville as a boys counselor in a combination kids camp and dude ranch called Silver Spur Ranch. So his senior year starts, and Landry, while contemplating marriage, didn't think he had the money to quite settle down yet. He had no real prospects lined up in the business world, and he was wondering what to do. His final season at UT as a Longhorn got off to a bad start as he had impacted wisdom teeth. He didn't play much or regain full strength until the last few games of the season. However, towards the end of the year, he turned in some good performances. By the end of the '48 season, he learned he'd been drafted by the New York Yankees of the All-American Football Conference, or AAFC, a competitor of the NFL that would eventually have the 49ers and Browns and Colts join the NFL. And when I say Colts, I'm talking about the original Colts franchise that folded in 1950, not the second Baltimore Colts team that went on to become the Indianapolis Colts. So, in his senior year, he started to give this more thought, thinking this could finally give him enough money to settle down with Alicia. One more game was left in the schedule, and this time it would be the Orange Bowl against the Georgia Bulldogs. With professional sports teams watching and paying attention on who would stand out, the timing couldn't be more perfect, as Landry had 117 yards rushing and a touchdown, with the Longhorns beating Georgia 41-28. And just like in a movie, Jack White, an assistant coach for the Yankees, approached Landry as he's walking off the field and offered him a contract to sign, which he did for $6,000 and a $500 signing bonus. Using the BLS inflation calculator, that salary is $74,193.86 in 2022 dollars. The $500 bonus is $6,182.82. So, he finally had enough money and got married, and this takes him to New York City, a town that would put him on the professional football map. That being said, he wasn't completely set financially. In fact, he wouldn't even get the $6,100 salary unless he made the team. So with his wife Alicia now pregnant, and due to the cost of living expenses in New York City, they decided she would stay behind in Houston with her family while he lived in New York. And as a rookie, he would get hazed again, just like in his freshman year in college, and he would also have to sing his high school song again, but as noted in the previous video, he sounded so bad they quickly regretted that. Landry wrote that back then, no one trained during the off-season, so it was common to see people arriving to training camp out of shape, and at first, when he saw some of the older players, this threw him off. However, by the end of camp, they would get back into shape and show they could really play. Since many people did that way back then, the feeling was you could get away with it, although in modern times, it would of course be a different story. So Landry was fighting for a spot to make the team when, during a preseason game against the Browns, the Yankees' main punter goes down, forcing Landry to set up the duties. He punted so well in that game, the head coach Red Schrader came up to him at the Cleveland rail station to let him know that he made the team. This was a big financial relief because he was finally going to start to get the rest of the money in his contract, and this meant he wasn't going to have to move back to Texas and start looking for a regular job outside of sports. Landry writes this was his first time experiencing New York City, so I'm curious about this, as when he was in the military, the Queen Mary was used to take him to Liverpool. While the Queen Mary had docked by New York City, it had also at times docked in Boston, so either Landry meant he had been in New York before, but this was the first time he actually got to see anything, or the Queen Mary took off from Boston or another port, and this was literally his first time there. From his text, it appears to be the second case. As someone that has traveled a decent amount, there are cities I've been to, but only technically. One of the more interesting facts about the New York Yankees football team is that they were owned by Dan Topping, the owner of the more famous Yankees baseball team. This wasn't just a case of someone being inspired by a baseball franchise and then copying the name. The person at the top was one and the same. So Landry got to see Yankee Stadium and see Joe DiMaggio's locker, as well as the locker of the other famous players at the time. And toward the end of his own football season, he got to watch them win 2 straight games to beat Ted Williams and the Boston Red Sox, thus winning the American League Championship and ensuring the Faustian Pact against Boston would continue for yet another year. If you go back and look at the photos of that game, it's a little interesting to think there's a small chance Tom Landry might be in one of them, even if he's just a small gray blur you can't even make out. Landry would mostly punt, but sometimes play backup running back to Buddy Young, who was much faster than him. In fact, Landry joked that when he came in to relieve Young, he was also giving the opposing defense a break. And the road games gave him further opportunities to be in places he'd never been before, such as when they played the Los Angeles Dons in the Coliseum, although the LA smog was only a much bigger problem back in 1949, as he remarked he was coughing periodically throughout the game. Despite the AAFC being a competitor to the NFL, it's interesting to see all the major stadiums they got to play in. As mentioned, not only did they use Yankee Stadium, but the Coliseum, and on top of that, soldier-filled. Although attendance was a big problem, and at times the stands resembled high school level attendance more than anything else. During the season, he lived at the Henry Hudson Hotel in West 57th with some of the other players. He would take the subway to Madison Square Garden to watch fights, and even though he liked exploring the city, he would get lonely and would want to come home to his pregnant wife. They wrote letters, but demonstrating just how rudimentary communication was back then, while they could make phone calls, they only did it once a week, as presumably it would have been too expensive to do it more. Additionally, in 1949, you couldn't just dial the person's number and instantly get connected long distance. For example, the following audio is from the radio show Dragnet that dramatizes what it was like.
Long distance.
This is Friday in Homicide. I'd like to place a call to Mr. Frank Renard in Murphy, Idaho. The number is 761.
Frank Renard, Murphy, Idaho, 761.
Yeah, that's right. The call's been cleared with the business office.
All right. Do you want me to call you back, Sergeant?
No, I'll hang on.
Okay, I'll place it for you. Long distance to Frank Renard, Murphy, Idaho. Murphy, 761. Okay. Your number, please.
Landry's most memorable game of the season, and memorable not in a good way, came against the Browns where he had to start at defensive back because of an injury to a starter. Cleveland coach Paul Brown and quarterback Otto Graham smelled blood in the water, and they targeted him all day. Browns receiver Max Speedy ended up with over 200 yards receiving. As embarrassing as this was, it taught Landry a lesson to accept his limitations and learn to deal with a faster opponent, not by following them step for step, but by studying their plays and learning to anticipate where they were going to go and then meeting there at the intersection. And in terms of speed, in case you're curious, Landry ran a 10.4 in the 100. On October 31st, Landry finally got a call from his wife letting him know their son had been born. She insisted they name the boy after him, and after the AAFC's last regular season game of Thanksgiving in San Francisco, Landry went home to be with his wife and his new child. They resolved they would never have another season apart, and she would be joining him in New York. Well, after the season was over, the league folded, but Landry was one of the lucky ones, as the New York Giants of the NFL decided to take some of the Yankees players into their team, and he was one of these selections. This was his official introduction into the league, and 1950 would set up a path where he would soon intersect with Vince Lombardi. This first year with the Giants felt like a second rookie season, as being that the Yankees came from a failed league that had never actually played an NFL team before, there were questions on just how good they would actually be. The Cleveland Browns, however, would blow out the defending NFL champions, the Philadelphia Eagles, by a score of 35-10, showing at least the Browns were for real. Well, the Giants had to play the Browns next, and their coach Steve Owens mentioned before the game he was going to confuse the Browns by using a 6-1-4 defense. Here's the thing, he didn't actually explain how that defense was going to be implemented. He instead left it up to the players to figure it out. Then, in the Cleveland hotel room before the game, he called on Landry to explain how the defense would work. Most likely not only because he had actual experience in playing against the Browns in the old AAFC, but he was also a defensive back, so he was a player with a perfect combination to give his thoughts. Coach Owens didn't tell Landry he was going to put him on the spot like this, but Landry and his teammates had talked this over on what they were going to do and knew basically what to say, so Landry went up to the chalkboard and had his very first coaching experience. Landry paraphrased himself, stating that the first words of the chalkboard were, "If the ends rush, the backs will do this. If they drop off the line, then we'll do this." Imagine a scenario, though, where Landry had only half-heartedly been paying attention and didn't know quite what to say. He wasn't the most talented athlete in the world, but he was ready. The effect worked, and the Giants shut down the Browns and won 6-0. The papers the next day called that Giant strategy the umbrella defense, as the one linebacker in the middle was kind of like the handle of an umbrella, while above him, the defensive players in the backfield moved around periodically, spreading out. So if you see someone claim that the umbrella defense originated with Landry, that's not completely accurate. Coach Owens was the one who decided to use that defense. However, he left it up to the players to decide on the specifics, and then Landry was the one at the chalkboard summing up what would be done in which scenario. So the Giants play the Browns again. This time Coach Owens mixes it up by using a 5-1-5 alignment, and once again that worked, and the Giants were victorious 17-13. At the end of the season, the Giants and the Browns were tied. In modern times, the Giants would have the tiebreaker and would have made the 1950 NFL championship game. But back then, these two teams would have to face each other once more to determine which one would be facing the Los Angeles Rams. This time, the Browns won 8-3, and they would capture it all by then beating the Rams for the crown. The following season, the Giants would lose twice to the Browns. It was clear their defense was working. They just needed an offense to complement it. So in 1952, from USC, they drafted Frank Gifford, although they initially mostly used him in defense for his rookie season. In addition to that, Kyle Rote, who had joined the Giants in 51, would finally be playing a full season, and he added a 1-2 punch with both his rushing and receiving. In 52, the Giants were being dominated in a game by the Steelers. First, Charlie Connolly gets knocked out of the game, and then the second-string quarterback, Fred Benners. So that leaves Landry to take over, as he was the only other Giants player on that team that had played quarterback before. So Landry goes in with the Steelers leading 38-0 in the second quarter. The odds are against him. Everyone is watching and hoping, but not expecting. It was then that Landry, in his own words, said that he scored a touchdown and engineered a comeback that led to the Steelers winning 63-7.
Takes the snap and runs it in for a touchdown. Thanks to Elway's patented last-second magic, the final score of Super Bowl 30, Denver 7, San Francisco 56.
What made that loss bad and puzzling is the Steelers were not a good team that year. They went 5-7. In fact, this was only the second game of that season where the Steelers scored more than 30 points. It's one of those odd cases where the phrase, "any given Sunday," comes into play. And Landry started one more game, also losing. Let's look at his quarterback stats for those two games. In those two matches, Landry completed 11 out of 47 passes for a 23.4 completion percentage, with one touchdown pass and 7 interceptions, and a quarterback rating of 9.8. Landry was able to have a sense of humor as he joked about this. In his defense, he had not played quarterback in any meaningful way in 5 years since injuring his thumb that affected his ability to properly grip a ball. And on top of that, he was doing it against NFL players and not college defenses. In fact, Landry remarked that he didn't know all the offensive plays, as by this time he was just in defense. Now, before this creates a false impression that Landry was mostly just an average player who got by with his intelligence, it should be noted he was actually doing well in other areas. In 1951, his second year with the Giants, he had 8 interceptions, returning 2 of them for touchdowns. And in 1952, he repeated that feat, scoring 1 touchdown. In 1953, it would dip down to 3 interceptions before going back up to 8 interceptions in 1955. And yes, he played back in the 50s when quarterbacks throwing many interceptions was common. However, even if you account for the new rule changes and he cut the interceptions in half, you still end up with 4 interceptions per year for 3 out of 4 years, which is a solid number. I'm now going to talk about punts, which, let's be honest, is the real reason why most of you are watching this. NFL fans can't get enough talks about punts. Don't get me started on punts. In all seriousness, Landry was a decent punter. His 40.9 career average per punt means as of 2022, there are only 143 players in NFL history that have a higher average than him. Although that doesn't put him in the top 100, he could hold his own. So he was actually accomplishing some things on the football field and not just being the stereotypical brainy backup. In 1953, however, things went from bad to worse. Even though they added Rosie Greer and Gifford was moved to offense, they won only 3 games all year. And in the second to last game of the year, the Browns beat them 62-10, and this, combined with the rest of the year, led to the forced retirement of Steve Owens. Landry entered the league before the age of the face mask, and this had its consequences. Hardy Brown, a linebacker in various teams, but perhaps most known as being a 49er, would launch himself at the head of players, and without the aforementioned face mask, this could lead to some severe injuries. Joe Jerry, of the Steelers, once had his eye get popped out of his socket. In Jerry's own words, he said, "I was laying there groggy, but I managed to ask one of my teammates, 'Is it bad?' And he said, 'Well, your eye's out.'" Now, whether the eye was partially lodged out or completely out of his head and hanging by its tendons depends on whom you ask. Jerry himself doesn't recall it that way, though. Landry didn't see the injury himself, but hearing stories about things like that must have affected him, and there was one gruesome injury he was present for. Joe Scott, a running back for the Giants, had his nose split open from the nostril to the bridge, causing blood to go everywhere. And of course, there was the famous Otto Graham injury that led to Paul Brown putting the face mask on his helmet. One of the funniest and craziest things pro football had back then was a bootsy play. Let me explain. If there was a player that was playing beyond an acceptable level of violence, or maybe they just pissed off the other team too much for whatever reason, then the Giants would run an offensive play where the ball would be snapped to the quarterback, and then every single Giants offensive player would try to tackle the defensive player they were mad at. Just a whole wasted offensive play to get retaliation. The first Giants player to tackle the target would then keep them down, and the rest of the offense would pile on top of them. Well, Jack Christensen of the Detroit Lions was once the target of this. However, he recognized what the Giants were doing, so he started to run backwards, and with everyone still in pursuit, not only did he run off the field, but he ran down into the tunnel, followed by the Giants' offense. Landry said it was one of the funniest things he's ever seen. The Giants' team physician was Doc Sweeney, who supposedly got the job because he was Steve Owens' brother-in-law. That's always a good reason to hire someone, because that never ever backfires and something never goes wrong. Okay, so one time, something went wrong. During a game, Landry split his lip open. He didn't leave though, and it wasn't until after it was over that Doc Sweeney decided to do something about it. So without giving Landry any anesthesia, he proceeds to try to sew his lip up by putting a needle through it. As it goes in one side of his lip and then exits out the other side, the doc remembered he forgot to attach thread to the needle. So he leaves Landry on the table with a needle sticking through his lip. That's the thing that happened. The top stars back then made around $25,000, with the rest of the players making far less and having to get second jobs during the offseason. The NFL didn't have a players' association until 1956, and thus the players, even if they held out, didn't have any real leverage. In fact, one Giants player, lineman Tex Coulter, tried this in an effort to get more money. He would eventually give in and went back to playing, and as a punishment, during a preseason game in Texas, the coach left him in all game on both offense and defense in 98-degree Texas heat. And in case you're curious as to what the Giants were doing playing in Texas at this time period, a year isn't given, and Coulter's last year was 1952, so this meant one of two things. If it was in 52, the Giants were playing a preseason game against the Dallas Texans. If it was 50 or 51, the other 2 years Landry played with them, and this would be because the NFL would sometimes play preseason games in towns that didn't have NFL teams in an effort to drum up interest in the league. Regardless, this served as a lesson to the rest of the players. Landry's daughter, Kitty, was born in 1952, and this meant that his wife had to juggle 2 kids while Landry played and went to school in the off-season in Houston. Their schedule was to live in New York for 4 months out of the year and then be in Houston for the rest. Yet Landry said the good outweighed the bad, as because players were unfortunately not paid as much money, they would pull their resources together and get hotel rooms to live in during the season, and this made the team a much more extended family than today, where players are free to move out to the suburbs, the place completely to themselves. Sometimes Landry and his family would stay with the families of other Giants players in Long Beach. One year they lived at the Excelsior off Central Park West, right across from the Museum of Natural History, and his son, Tom Jr., of course, loved that. Landry thought the city felt much safer back then, and his wife didn't think anything of taking her 2 children with her on the subway to get around town. And of course, he had Central Park. Frank Gifford would act as a babysitter to the team's children, and he would often be seen with them in Central Park. Just imagine, you're living in New York and you see Giant star Frank Gifford. That would be interesting enough, but then he's followed by a whole bunch of kids. And then you see the same thing, day after day after day. Eventually, though, that ended, as an official from the city had a policeman come up and tell them they couldn't do that anymore because they were killing the grass. And Landry and his family got to see Broadway plays such as South Pacific, My Fair Lady, Sound of Music, and Peter Pan. As he got older and slower, he had to rely on his mind and strategy to be more effective, and the analytical engineering training he was taking in school really helped him break down the game to its nuts and bolts. That's all for now. I had originally anticipated this video series not being so long, but I'm finding so much information in my research, which is a good thing, that I've decided to continue digging deep. When we pick up next time, we'll continue to follow Landry's life and how at that point, even though he was breaking down the game in his mind more and more, he never really thought about becoming a coach. Then 1954 came, and he met the new offensive coordinator for the New York Giants. His name? Vince Lombardi. See you next time.